This interview is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History.
I'm Bob LeBrant for the Michigan Political History Society. I'm speaking today with Judge Bob Danhof, whose career in law and public service has spanned over 50 years. Judge Danhof has had a distinguished career as a United States Attorney, Constitutional Convention delegate. At the Constitutional Convention, he was the chairman of the Committee on the Judicial Branch. He was a candidate for Attorney General. He was in the Romney administration, the legislative and legal advisor, and then for 23 years a judge on the Michigan Court of Appeals, 16 of those years as chief judge.
My wife and I went all the way through school together from the beginning, and we got married after we got out of college. And when I got out of college, we first settled in Muskegon. The early life politically, a little interesting. I can remember my parents were both active politically, particularly my mother. And sitting on a wagon, I think, holding a flare, and they used to call them torchlight parades. A little downtown Zeeland, the Saturday night was a big time. And so that was, my parents were active politically. And in the Republican Party, when you come from that side of the state, it's Republican. So it goes back a long way. After my father passed away in '58, my mother still stayed active. And she was vice chairman of the Republican County Committee in Ottawa and served on the county Board of Canvassers right up until she died in 1975. So I had a really sort of a background political activity from the time I was in high school and thereon.
What attracted you to the law?
Oh, I basically, I don't know, it just seemed very interesting. There were other Danhofs who were in the law. From early on in high school, I took debate and things like that, and I sort of looked to a legal career. After law school, we moved up to Muskegon, where I went into private practice, but I immediately got active in the Young Republicans with a bunch of young lawyers, some of which, of course, were just out of school as I was because they'd been delayed by the war. And we got active in Muskegon County, and we eventually, I remember in '52, we took over the county convention from sort of the old guard. And we were all Eisenhower people. That's the first big political campaign that I got into. The older guard was more like for Senator Taft. And I can remember going by myself to Chicago in that convention. A friend of mine had been down there. He was an alternate delegate. I slept on the floor of his room in the Stevens Hotel. And we went out to the stadium and watched part of the proceedings where Everett McKinley Dirksen pointed to Tom Dewey and said, "You have led us down the primrose path." We were dodging our Andy Frame ushers. And then I got a call one day in the United States Senate race. As you know, Senator Arthur Vandenberg had died, and Blair Moody Sr. had been appointed. And he was...
Blair Moody was a newspaperman, wasn't he?
He was in Washington, and Governor Williams had appointed him to the United States Senate. And there was a primary going on between John B. Martin, who was the Auditor General at that time, and a Congressman, Charlie Potter, who came from Sheboygan. Well, of course, being from Muskegon, most of the Republicans were with Martin. I sort of had not committed.
Where was Martin from?
Grand Rapids.
Oh, Grand Rapids.
He'd been a state senator and was Auditor General. Pretty well-known name there. But I got a call one day from the county chairman, who was a young friend of mine, one of the young ones, said, "This fellow Potter's coming to town, and we got to have somebody. You think you might be interested in his campaign?" I looked around, and Charlie Potter was a World War II war veteran, had both legs shot off, or gone by just much like John Swainson, except his were above the knee, was a congressman. And I met the man, and I sort of, running with Eisenhower, it seemed to me, and Blair Moody being an incumbent, be a tough race. So I said yes, and I signed on to the Potter campaign. Well, Potter beat Martin in the primary and got elected. With that came the opportunity. Senator Potter was given the leeway of picking the United States Attorney for the Western District. Senator Homer Ferguson was the senior senator. He said he'd take Detroit. He chose Wendell Miles, who was the prosecuting attorney of Ottawa County. His father was a circuit judge. I was only 3 years out of law school. But I knew of Mr. Miles, Wendell Miles, went to see him in Grand Haven, said I would be interested in being assistant United States attorney. And we waited about a week, and he called back and said, well, if I get confirmed, you're in. So I left private practice, and I commuted to Grand Rapids, and I went to work as assistant United States attorney. We covered the same territory as they do today. We had 2 assistants, U.S. attorney and 2 assistants. Today, last I talked, I think I asked Mike Detmer, I think they had something like 31 assistants. And we covered the whole deal with the 3 of us. So I left and I started in the U.S. Attorney's Office as Assistant United States Attorney. 3 years out of law school, it was pretty good. And I remember the article in the Muskegon Chronicles read, local attorney starts new job and has a new son. And my second son had been born on June 28th, and I started the first week in July. So with that, I got into the U.S. Attorney's Office, and that was, in those days, not so much today, they are civil service, but it was strictly a political appointed office. I mean, you were Republicans, the whole administration changed. And so we replaced Joe Deeb and 2 assistants, and Wendell and I, and later a gentleman named Roman Snow, Bud Snow. It turned out eventually that all 3 of us became judges. Roman Snow became police judge, a circuit judge. I went on the appellate bench. Wendell Miles was First Circuit and a federal district. So, but that was my first so-called political job, and I stayed with that until through all the 50s. I enjoyed working with the FBI, the Secret Service.
Well, what sorts of prosecutions did you have to do?
Oh, we had everything. And in those days, we were not departmentalized. Whoever walked in. I prosecuted a bank robbery after the fact. I prosecuted the immediate Republican County, Muskegon County chairman for mail fraud, whose daughter and my son started kindergarten together. I went to Judge Miles, later Judge Miles, and said, you know, maybe you want to take this one over. He said, yeah, sure, you started. And he pled guilty, and it was a mail fraud deal. He had a catalog deal with. But those types of cases, plus civil cases, auto accidents, bankruptcy, tax collections, it didn't make any difference because we were so small, you just did what you did.
In the days before I-96, how long would your commute between Muskegon and Grand Rapids take?
It would take a good 30 minutes in those days. It's a lot shorter now, maybe 15 or 20 at the most parking. But that was on the old road. But once in a while I had people who would be surprised. There were other people. Some gal worked for the Labor Mediation Board. For a while I commuted with the aircraft recruiter, the Air Corps recruiter who was in Grand Rapids. But I stayed there all the time. Almost moved, but then I thought politically, you know, Muskegon were my base. And so, we had 2 children eventually. Early part of 60, my oldest daughter was born. And Judge Wendell Miles came along and said, I'm going to seek the Republican nomination for Attorney General in this state. That would be in 1960. And so he had to resign when he got that as a United States Attorney. And immediately there were 2 federal judges to appoint because there was no time in justice. And then one was a Republican nominee and one was a Democrat nominee, but they appointed me to be the United States Attorney. And so that was
going into 1960.
Yeah, that takes us about through the 50s. And again, you know, we were active politically. Because of the Hatch Act, I couldn't be overt. I couldn't belong to the party. I couldn't become a delegate. But we still went to the state conventions, Judge Miles and I. And so I stayed active. Early in 1960, before I became U.S. Attorney, I decided maybe, well, it was time for a change. That was going on 7 years. I decided I might run for probate judge. We had an incumbent who had resigned to make some more money, went into the bank as trust officer. Governor Williams had appointed a prosecutor, 4-term prosecutor. But I checked the results. Now, this is nonpartisan. So Justice Department cleared it from the Hatch Act because it wasn't partisan. I analyzed a lot of votes and decided that I would have a good opportunity. Because in the nonpartisan area, in the Democrat areas, the fall off in some places was 90% between the partisan and the nonpartisan. In the Republican areas, it might fall off 15, 20, 25%. I figured if I could work that, I'd have a shot, even though he was the incumbent.